They called her Tin Soldier, and Dr. Adrian Prescott meant it as an insult. Danielle Ross had been at Cedar Creek Medical for exactly 6 months, and the nickname had taken root in the third-floor break room like a virus nobody bothered to treat. It started during morning rounds when she moved past the nursing station with too much precision, spine vertical, shoulders back, every gesture economical and controlled. Prescott had leaned against the counter, coffee cup balanced in one hand, and said it loud enough for the surgical team to hear, at ease, "Tin Soldier. This isn't Fort Carson." The residents had laughed. The attending physicians had smiled. Even some of the nurses had exchanged knowing glances, the kind that meant they understood the natural order of things at Cedar Creek, and Danielle Ross, clearly, did not. What they didn't know was that her spine stayed vertical because 3 separate combat deployments had taught her that slouching got you killed. What they didn't know was that every gesture was economical because she'd spent 20 years in special operations, where wasted motion meant mission failure. What they didn't know was that the tarnished challenge coin she kept in her left scrub pocket, touching it every hour like checking a weapon, was made from aircraft shrapnel recovered after a compound bombing in Kandahar, a reminder from an 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble 2 decades ago, before that boy had become a man, before that man had become a warrior, before that warrior had needed her again in ways that classified briefings couldn't fully explain. She certainly didn't know that Cedar Creek Medical wasn't actually her assignment. It was her mission. The hospital sprawled across 12 acres of Colorado Springs real estate, 344 beds divided between emergency medicine, orthopedic surgery, trauma, and cardiac care. To the hospital administration, Danielle Ross was simply another experienced trauma nurse with an unusual military bearing and impeccable credentials. To the Pentagon, she was Commander Danielle Ross, embedded on a classified intelligence operation tasked with monitoring one specific person buried deep in hospital administration, Dr. Chen, former asset, now suspected of selling medical supply routes and pharmaceutical procurement data to hostile actors operating out of 3 countries. The routes themselves meant nothing. The data meant everything. Danielle had arrived under her own name, using her own credentials, her actual medical license legitimate and unimpeachable. The nurse uniform was real. The stethoscope was real. The deception was the only part that required constant maintenance. She checked vitals on a post-operative patient in Recovery Bay 3, her hand steady as she recorded blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rate into the chart. The patient, a 68-year-old woman recovering from a total knee replacement, watched her with the expression most people adopted around Danielle, a mixture of respect and mild confusion, as though she'd just realized her nurse was fluent in a language nobody else in the room understood. "You move like you're military," the patient had said on the first post-op check. Danielle had smiled, touched the challenge coin through her scrub pocket, and said simply, "Thank you for noticing." She didn't correct people anymore. Correction required explanation, and explanation required lies layered on top of classified truths that would dissolve under scrutiny. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant mechanical prayer, a sound she'd learned to filter out years ago but could never quite forget. The rhythm of hospital machinery, ventilators wheezing, monitors beeping in polyrhythmic staccato, for pumps delivering measured drops of medication into waiting veins, had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She moved through Cedar Creek's corridors like water-finding channels, efficient, unremarkable, invisible in the way people who've learned to disappear are always invisible. A physician assistant nodded at her in passing. A surgical tech asked about vitals on a patient down the hall. Nobody looked twice. Nobody saw the combat boots under the scrubs, military issue, laced to regulation tightness. Nobody noticed that her trauma shears, hanging from a carabiner at her hip, had her old call sign engraved into the handle in letters too small to see unless you knew to look. In the break room that afternoon, Danielle was standing alone at the coffee maker when Prescott arrived. She'd recognized his voice before she turned, a kind of confident baritone that came from people who'd never experienced real consequences, people who'd built entire hierarchies around their own comfort and the discomfort of everyone beneath them. He was speaking to 3 surgical residents, his body language the physical manifestation of a man accustomed to dominating every room he entered. She poured her coffee, black, no sugar, and waited for him to notice her, because men like Prescott always needed to be noticed. "I give her a week," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. maybe 2 if she's stubborn. These military types, they can't adapt. She'll realize pretty quick that the rigid approach doesn't work in a civilian hospital. He turned then, seeing her, and smiled with teeth that looked expensive and exactly as insincere as she'd expected. Isn't that right, tin soldier? You're not really cut out for this place, are you? Danielle took a measured breath. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the physical toll of holding back 20 years of survival training and combat experience while a man who'd probably never been punched in the face used words like weapons. She'd learned early that flinching gave people power. That showing anger gave people ammunition. That the only real strength lay in the ability to absorb damage without permitting it to change your expression. She looked at Prescott for 3 full seconds without speaking, let the silence gather weight, and then said quietly, "I think you have a patient in Bay 2. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement, really, it was just the truth, spoken in the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Prescott's jaw tightened. He didn't move. Around them, the break room had gone very still, the way rooms go still when they contain a predator and its prey and nobody's quite sure which is which. A junior resident pretended to concentrate on a vending machine. A nurse practitioner suddenly became very interested in the contents of the refrigerator. The air pressure in the space seemed to change, the oxygen getting thinner, like the atmosphere itself was responding to something it didn't quite understand. "I'm the chief of emergency medicine," Prescott said, and there was an edge in his voice now, the sound of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of subordinates. "I decide when to see patients." "The monitor," Danielle said, not moving, "shows ST elevation. You have approximately 4 minutes before that changes from diagnostic to symptomatic." She paused, letting that register. "I think you have a patient in Bay 2. He left. The surgical residents followed. The room returned to normal oxygen levels, but something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure. The staff members remaining in the break room were looking at Danielle now with expressions that contained something other than amusement. The surgical tech made brief eye contact and then looked away. The nurse practitioner appeared to be making a mental note about something. Nobody said anything. In hospitals, silence after conflict meant witnesses, and witnesses meant memory. What they'd just seen was a nurse suggesting that the chief of emergency medicine was negligent. What Prescott would remember was a moment when his authority had been challenged without outright insubordination, in front of people who'd have to choose between loyalty to their department head and acknowledgement of what they'd just heard. He would make her pay for that, Danielle thought as she returned to the emergency department. Prescott was the kind of man who kept careful inventory of perceived slights. He was also clearly intelligent enough to understand that direct confrontation with her in front of staff wouldn't work. She wasn't going to cry in a supply closet, wasn't going to complain to HR about his behavior, wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction beyond that terrible, calm observation. Which meant he would find other avenues. More sophisticated approaches. The kinds of institutional weapons available to a man who controlled schedules, performance reviews, staff assignments, and the ear of hospital administration. The next 4 hours passed in the steady rhythm of emergency medicine, a motor vehicle accident victim with femur fracture, an elderly patient in acute heart failure, a child with appendicitis, a construction worker with a laceration requiring sutures. Danielle worked through each case with the kind of competence that left no room for criticism, her movements precise, her documentation meticulous, her bedside manner respectful enough to appear deferential. Every vital sign recorded. Every medication verified. Every protocol followed. She was building a record of perfection, one shift at a time, and she knew Prescott was aware of this. Perfection was the only shield available to someone in her position, the only armor that worked in a civilian hospital where she couldn't claim the legal protections that military rank afforded. At 11:47 p.m., as the emergency department was transitioning from night shift to graveyard, Danielle stepped into the parking lot and let the Colorado Springs air hit her face, cold, thin, carrying the faint smell of diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay. She touched the challenge coin through her scrub pocket. In the hospital, she was Danielle Ross, trauma nurse. Outside the hospital, she was still Danielle Ross, trauma nurse. The woman who'd carried a bleeding 8-year-old through enemy territory, the woman who'd given her own blood when the medics ran out, the woman who'd visited a refugee camp every week until adoption paperwork finally cleared. That woman lived in the space between her visible life and her classified one, in the silence that came from holding too many secrets, in the weight of a coin made from aircraft shrapnel and remorse. She had no idea what was about to arrive at Cedar Creek Medical in 72 hours. She didn't know yet that a medevac helicopter from Joint Base Andrews would land on the trauma pad with a Green Beret colonel aboard, a man with catastrophic blast injuries and a classified history that connected directly to her past. She didn't know that everything she'd built here, the perfect nursing record, the invisible presence, the military precision disguised as civilian competence, would collapse the moment that helicopter door opened. But Prescott, sitting in his office 20 floors up, was already planning his next move. He was already considering how to turn her perfection against her, how to use institutional power to isolate and eliminate the one person on his floor who wouldn't laugh at his jokes, wouldn't defer to his ego, wouldn't treat him like the authority he believed himself to be. He didn't know yet that she was a warrior. He thought she was just a nurse. That was his first mistake. The crash of ceramic on tile echoed through the Cedar Creek Medical cafeteria like a gunshot. Danielle's lunch tray, salad, coffee, the protein bar she'd been saving for the 1800 to the 0600 shift, scattered across the floor in a constellation of debris. Dr. Prescott stood directly in front of her, his expensive Italian loafers positioned precisely where her tray had been 1 second before. Around them, the cafeteria went silent. Every conversation stopped. Forks paused midway to mouths. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder in the sudden quiet. "Tin soldier," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who knew the room was watching. "Tell me, do they teach bedside manner in the barracks, or just how to follow orders without thinking?" Laughter rippled through the tables. Nervous laughter. The kind that comes from people caught between entertainment and discomfort, not sure which side they're actually on. A resident at the corner table grinned. A pharmacy tech chuckled. Most of the nursing staff just watched, their expressions carefully neutral. Danielle looked at the food scattered across the floor. Coffee pooled around pieces of ceramic. Lettuce had skittered under a nearby chair. She took one measured breath, the kind trained into her body 20 years ago, the kind that came before you moved, before you spoke, before you did anything that might get people killed. Her hands remained steady at her sides. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't waver. She met Dr. Prescott's gaze directly. And a single tear escaped down her left cheek. Not from sadness. Not from humiliation. From the sheer effort of restraint, the physical toll of holding back what her body had been trained to do in response to provocation. The tear was the price of discipline. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her movement precise and controlled, the way you'd wipe away sweat after a sprint. "Your insecurity is showing, doctor," she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Much worse. She knelt to clean it herself while he walked away, and the cafeteria slowly returned to its fractured conversations. Someone whispered something to the pharmacy tech. A nurse looked away. Danielle gathered the broken pieces into her hands, feeling the weight of every eye that had watched. Not eyes of sympathy. Eyes of fear. They'd seen what happened. They'd seen what would happen if they were next. By Thursday morning, the campaign had shifted into something more systematic. Dr. Prescott was smarter than simple public humiliation. He understood institutional power. He understood how to weaponize the machinery of a hospital against someone who couldn't fight back without exposing herself. During shift change at 0645, with 18 staff members clustered around the central nursing station, he made his announcement. His voice was loud enough to carry but casual enough to seem almost conversational. "I'm making a public bet," he said, looking directly at Danielle while addressing the room. "Tin soldier quits within 1 week. $20 says she doesn't last until Friday." He pulled out a bill and laid it flat on the counter. "Anyone want to take that action?" No one did. The charge nurse looked away. The two RNs who typically went to lunch with Danielle suddenly became very interested in their computer screens. A resident Danielle had helped through a difficult resuscitation the week before didn't meet her eyes. Danielle initialed the medication log with steady hands. Her handwriting was precise, each letter exactly the same size as the others, no tremor, no hesitation. The pen didn't shake. Her fingers didn't fumble. She was a weapon at rest, and weapons at rest don't show cracks. The worst part wasn't that he'd made the bet. It was that people wanted to believe him. Friday afternoon arrived with the weight of accumulated humiliation. Dr. Prescott called her to the nurse's station in front of the charge nurse, 2 staff RNs, and a medical student who'd been shadowing the ER all week. He had 3 patient charts in his hands. He dropped them. Not gently. Not accidentally. He released them from waist height and let gravity do the work. They hit the tile floor and papers exploded everywhere, pages fanning out like a deck of cards scattered by an angry hand. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched to be friendly to the audience and contemptuous to the recipient. "Maybe if you spent less time standing at attention and more time doing your job, you'd remember how filing systems work." The medical student's eyes widened. The charge nurse's jaw tightened. One of the RNs actually took a step back. Danielle absorbed the insult with one measured breath. She could smell the antiseptic that perpetually clung to hospital tile, the faint undertone of bleach, the coffee he'd been drinking. She could feel the weight of every person in the room measuring her response, wondering if she'd break, if she'd argue, if she'd give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Another tear escaped. Not a stream. Not a visible breakdown. Just one tear, the way rain sometimes falls in a single drop on a windshield before the storm hits. She wiped it. "I'll get those filed immediately, doctor," she said, her voice carrying the kind of precision that doesn't leave room for argument. Not subservient. Not weak. Just competent. She bent to gather the scattered papers while he smirked at the charge nurse, and she became invisible again. Just one more person doing the work that hospitals couldn't function without, the work that got done in hallways and supply closets and moments when no one important was watching. That evening, she found her personnel file had been updated. 14 new reports. Tardiness on March 14th, except she'd worked the night shift that day and her badge swipe was timestamped at 1847. Uniform violation on March 18th, she'd been wearing the exact same scrubs as everyone else. Documentation error on a chart dated March 22nd, a patient she'd never treated, in a unit she didn't work. Each report was meticulously formatted, each one signed by Dr. Prescott with dates and times that created the appearance of a careful record keeper documenting genuine problems. It was beautiful in its precision. It was the work of someone who understood that the most lethal weapon in an institution isn't anger. It's documentation. It's a paper trail that accumulates like snow, each flake seemingly insignificant until suddenly the whole landscape has been buried. The nursing staff whispered about it. Danielle could see it in the hallways, the way conversations would stop when she approached, the way people would suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Fear was contagious. If Prescott could do this to her, he could do it to anyone. And worse, he could do it carefully enough that it would hold up in an HR review, would survive scrutiny, would create just enough reasonable doubt that no one would risk their own position defending her. Danielle carried the challenge coin in her pocket during all of it. She could feel its weight against her thigh like an anchor. Tarnished brass, engraved with markings that meant something to 3 people in the world. A reminder. A connection. A promise made in a refugee camp 20 years ago that if anything ever went truly wrong, there were people who would come. But that wasn't yet. That wasn't close. And then the trauma alert sounded at 0400 Saturday morning, and everything changed direction in the time it took a helicopter to cross 40 miles of Colorado sky. The medevac alert came through the overhead speakers at 0403 Saturday morning, and the Cedar Creek Emergency Department shifted into overdrive. Trauma alert. Multiple combat casualties inbound from Kandahar. 23 minutes out. The ER staff moved like synchronized swimmers, each person knowing their place in the choreography of organized chaos. Gurneys unlocked from their wall mounts. Trauma bays cleared. Blood products requisitioned from the bank. The kind of efficiency that only comes from having done this 1,000 times before, the muscle memory of saving lives written into bone and sinew. Danielle heard the announcement while standing at the medication station, double-checking a discharge prescription for an elderly patient with pneumonia. She didn't move. Didn't look up. Just finished the signature and placed the paperwork in the discharge envelope. The routine of it was what kept her grounded, the small tasks, the steady hands, the breath in and breath out that had sustained her through 2 decades of worse things than an angry hospital administrator. But the medevac changed that. Dr. Prescott emerged from his office, and she watched his transformation from behind the nurse's station. The arrogance dropped away. The jaw tightened. His eyes found the trauma board and locked there like a target acquisition system. He moved toward the bay with the fluid precision of someone stepping into his true calling. Surgery was his religion, and trauma was scripture. He began issuing orders before he was even across the threshold, his voice pitched low and authoritative, the kind of voice that made people move. She had to admit it, when lives were on the line, Prescott was competent. Dangerous, yes. But competent. The helicopter touched down on the roof at 0 for 26. Danielle heard the rotor wash vibrate through the ceiling tiles, felt it in her sternum like a second heartbeat. The noise was distinctive, UH-60M Black Hawk, the kind of aircraft that only carried the worst cases, the ones where minutes meant the difference between catastrophic injuries that could be survived and catastrophic injuries that simply couldn't. She'd heard that sound across 4 continents and 2 decades. She'd run toward it when everyone else ran away. The rotor wash was muscle memory. The colonel arrived in Bay 3 at 0431 on a trauma gurney that looked too small to hold him, though that was probably an illusion created by the severity of what the combat medic was relaying in rapid-fire medical shorthand. Blast injuries to the lower extremities. Shrapnel embedded near the cardiac silhouette. Respiratory distress developing in transit. Blood pressure 94/58 and trending. 2 large boreholes running wide open. The medic's face was the color of old concrete, exhaustion and adrenaline written in equal measure across his features. Danielle watched from the medication station as the colonel was transferred from the medevac gurney to the hospital bed, the movement swift and practiced. 1, 2, 3, lift. The nursing team swarmed. Monitor leads. Oxygen mask. Additional for access. A resident approached with scissors to begin cutting away the combat uniform, revealing what the injury report had only partially described. Blast damage. Shrapnel laceration along the left anterior chest. Compartment syndrome swelling in the left leg where the blood supply had been compromised by the force of the explosion. The colonel's eyes were open but unfocused, the kind of unfocused that came from shock and blood loss, the body's emergency shutdown protocol kicking in because there wasn't enough consciousness left to stay awake. And then she saw his face clearly. The scar pattern was different. Older. The Afghan boy's face had been rounder, softer, marked by the particular geometry of childhood. But the eyes were the same shade of amber, the same shape, the same quality of fierce intelligence that had looked up at her from beneath a collapsed concrete wall in Pulialam district in 2004, 20 years and approximately 2,000 miles ago. She'd pulled him from that rubble with her own hands, blood and dust coating both of them, his left arm hanging at an angle that meant it was broken in at least 2 places. 8 years old. Speaking Pashto and English both, asking if his mother was under the next piece of concrete, asking if he could help her dig. The room tilted slightly. Danielle gripped the edge of the medication station. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands didn't shake. This was the kind of moment that could derail everything, the mission, the cover, the 2 years of careful infiltration. 1 second of reaction, 1 moment of recognition shown on her face, and Dr. Prescott or any of the other physicians would have marked her as personally invested. Bias. Conflict of interest. Grounds for immediate removal from the trauma response. She waited for the moment to pass. Counted the breaths. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The training from Quantico reasserted itself, compartmentalize an, operational security, the ability to function when the personal and professional collided at precisely the worst intersection. By 0:45, the Colonel's condition had begun to deteriorate in ways that the initial assessment had only hinted at. His chest was rising asymmetrically now, the left side lagging behind the right. The monitor began recording decreased breath sounds on the left. The oxygen saturation numbers on the pulse oximeter ticked downward like an unwinding clock: 96, 94, 91, 88. The ventilator was trying to push oxygen into lungs that were rapidly becoming unavailable for the task, the collapse happening in real time because of the tension developing in the left pleural space. Tension pneumothorax. Air was leaking from the punctured lung into the space between the lung and the chest wall, and it wasn't being reabsorbed. Instead it was accumulating, building pressure like a hand slowly closing into a fist inside his ribcage. Dr. Prescott moved to the bedside, his movements sharp and efficient. Needle decompression. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and alcohol prep. His voice carried the particular tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. A nurse reached for the equipment drawer, but her hands were trembling slightly, whether from the gravity of the moment or from something else Danielle couldn't determine. The nurse, Jennifer, probably 6 months into her career, fumbled with the packaging. The needle decompression kit slipped from her fingers and scattered across the tile floor, the gleaming stainless steel catching the overhead lights as it rolled. 3 seconds evaporated. Prescott's jaw clenched. Again. Now. Another nurse approached with a replacement kit. The Colonel's oxygen saturation was at 79 now, the number that medical textbooks marked as the line between survivable brain damage and unsurvivable brain damage, the threshold where every second counted and there were no seconds left to waste. Prescott felt for the anatomy landmarks on the Colonel's left side, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the exact point where the needle would need to go to access the pressurized space and let the trapped air escape. His hand moved into position. And then it stopped. Danielle watched his hesitation from across the trauma bay, saw it in the micropause before the needle advanced. Not uncertainty about the procedure itself, Prescott had performed hundreds of needle decompressions. But something about this patient, this constellation of injuries, this specific moment had created a moment of calculus. Complex blast injuries had a way of hiding their true extent. Shrapnel near the cardiac silhouette meant there was metal in places where needle decompression might encounter it. The chest tube might perforate a coronary artery. The needle might miss the pleural space entirely. The margin for error had compressed to something approaching zero. The Colonel's oxygen saturation hit 75. That was the moment the paralysis took full hold. Prescott's needle was advancing, but his movements had become deliberate and careful in a way that cost time. The rest of the trauma team had gone quiet, the usual chatter of organized chaos replaced by something closer to holding their breath. The resident checking the monitor kept glancing at the attending, waiting for direction that wasn't coming fast enough. A nurse stepped toward the defibrillator cart, preparing for the eventuality that everyone in the room could see but no one was saying aloud, this patient's heart was going to stop if the pressure in his chest wasn't relieved in the next 90 seconds. Danielle moved. She didn't think about it. Didn't calculate the risk. Didn't weigh the institutional consequences or the professional ramifications or the way that leaving her position to enter a trauma bay where she hadn't been assigned violated approximately 17 different protocols and probably constituted enough grounds for termination that Dr. Prescott would frame it like a charitable act. Her feet carried her toward her locker. The MRE she kept in the bottom of her emergency bag was a habit from 20 years of field medicine, from deployments where equipment didn't always materialize when you needed it and improvisation meant the difference between a patient living and a patient becoming a body bag. The field meal package, the main course components were largely irrelevant, but the plastic packaging was designed for durability, for remaining intact even when everything around it was turning to shrapnel. She extracted it with one motion while running back toward Bay 3, her boots sounding sharp against the tile floor in the way that hospital sounds do when the ambient noise has dropped below a certain threshold. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Dr. Prescott saw her enter the bay and his voice cut across the space like a blade. "Get out. You're not authorized for trauma response." but she was already moving to the colonel's left side, already feeling for the anatomy beneath the blood and the dressings, already fashioning a temporary chest seal from the MRE packaging because the principle was identical whether the situation was a forward operating base in Helmand Province or a trauma bay in Colorado Springs. The barrier didn't have to be perfect. It just had to hold long enough. She found the second intercostal space. Her hands moved on their own, the muscle memory of 1,000 field resuscitations taking over. She inserted the needle, a 16-gauge for catheter from the emergency cart, not ideal but functional. The hiss of air escaping. That particular sound that meant pressure was being relieved, that meant the lung could begin expanding again. The monitor responded immediately. The oxygen saturation began climbing. 76, 78. 81, 85. The colonel's chest began rising more symmetrically, both sides participating in the work of breathing. The lines of strain around his eyes eased fractionally, the kind of easing that came when pressure was being released from vital structures. Dr. Prescott's face had gone the color of old blood. "What the hell did you just do? That's not sterile equipment. That's not protocol." His voice was shaking now, and it wasn't the kind of shaking that came from concern about the patient. "You contaminated the field. You introduced a foreign object with non-standard materials. Get out of this bay before I have security escort you out." Danielle stepped back from the bed. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would matter, no explanation that would alter the calculation he was already running in his mind. She could see it in his eyes, the recognition that she had just performed a life-saving procedure using unconventional methodology and that the patient's condition had immediately improved. That was going to infuriate him in ways that any professional disagreement never could, because it challenged the narrative he'd been constructing about her incompetence. She walked out of Bay 3 and returned to the medication station. The colonel's oxygen saturation was holding at 86 now. The monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm. The team was moving again, the paralysis broken, orders being issued and followed, the machinery of institutional trauma care reasserting itself. An attending surgeon was being paged overhead. The trauma surgeon on call was already changing into scrubs. The message came to her phone at 13:47. "Report to administration immediately." Not a request. Not a courtesy notification. A command, the particular tone that hospital administration used when they'd already decided on the outcome and were simply going through the formalities of delivery. Danielle looked at the text. Then she gathered her things, switched off her locker light, and walked toward the elevators. The fluorescent lights buzzed their fluorescent hum. Rain was starting to streak the windows on the eastern side of the building, the kind of spring rain that came to Colorado Springs when the weather couldn't decide between two seasons. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 5th floor, already knowing what was waiting there, already aware that the professional architecture she'd built over 2 years was about to come down very quickly, and that the mission parameters that had brought her here were about to become significantly more complicated. The elevator doors closed, and somewhere in Bay 3, a colonel who'd been 8 years old the last time she'd seen his face was finally beginning to breathe more easily because she'd broken every rule the hospital had written. The elevator climbed toward the 5th floor while Danielle's hands remained steady against the brushed steel railings. She'd performed worse under fire. This was just paperwork. Institutional violence dressed in HR language. The doors hissed open and she walked toward administration without hesitation, the kind of walk that made people instinctively step aside, muscle memory from 20 years of command presence bleeding through a nurse's scrubs. Dr. Prescott was already waiting in the hallway outside the conference room, 3 board members positioned behind him like subordinates who didn't yet realize they were. His smile had the quality of something sharp, like a knife catching light. "Commander," he said, testing the word on his tongue as if it tasted foreign. "We need to discuss protocol violations." "I'm aware." She didn't ask how he knew the rank. Details like that would come later. What mattered now was the next 72 hours. The conference room smelled of burnt coffee and the particular sterility that came from industrial-grade air filtration. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the insistent whine of dying ballasts. Prescott had prepared a presentation, slides, documentation, witness statements printed and organized with the precision of a man who'd been planning this assault for longer than 3 days. He'd been planning it since the moment she arrived. 17 protocol violations filled the first slide. She read through them with the same detached focus she'd once used to read tactical intelligence reports. Unauthorized use of non-sterile materials. Performing procedures outside her nursing scope. Insubordination in the presence of medical staff. Practicing without appropriate licensure documentation. Each violation was technically accurate and completely missing the point. The patient's oxygen saturation was 58%, she said quietly. His lung was collapsing. The trauma surgeon was 90 seconds out. Our protocols exist for a reason, Ms. Ross. Prescott emphasized the demotion from commandatum to this deliberate erasure. We cannot allow individual practitioners to bypass established procedures, regardless of their personal assessment of the situation. One of the board members, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, leaned forward. Did you use materials not on the hospital's approved supply list? MRE medical packaging. Field issue chest seal components. I've carried them for 20 years. That answers the question, Prescott said. He opened a folder containing what looked like Joint Commission regulations printed from an obscure database. Regulation 47C, subsection 12, paragraph 4. Language about non-standard medical supplies and maintenance of institutional integrity. We also have statements from FA nurses regarding your unauthorized intervention. The statements were predictable. She'd expected them. One nurse had written she did not request physician authorization, another noted procedure was not performed under medical supervision, a third simply documented timeline without interpretation. These were frightened people protecting their own positions. She didn't blame them. What she noticed was the fourth statement, written in nervous handwriting by a junior nurse named Jen. She saved his life. I know the rules say, I know we're not supposed to, but his oxygen was dropping so fast and Dr. Prescott told us to wait for the attending and I thought he was dying and she just knew what to do. Prescott dismissed that one with a casual flick of a finger. Emotional response. Not relevant. 3 board members nodded. The woman with the reading glasses made a note. None of them had been in the ER. None of them had watched a man's blood oxygen collapse to the saturation level where organ failure becomes irreversible. They'd never performed triage on a battlefield. They'd never made the choice between rules and lives. We're going to need to see your credentials, another board member said. Full nursing file, licenses, any certifications you listed during hiring. My file is complete and current. She kept her voice level. Professional. The voice of someone who understood institutional protocols. Everything has been verified. Prescott's smile widened. We'll see about that. She walked out of that conference room knowing what was happening. This was stage 4 of his escalation, the strategic move designed to remove her from the building permanently. He'd probably already made calls to the state nursing board. He might have contacted the hospital's legal counsel about liability. He'd certainly prepared a termination document. What he didn't know was that her credentials weren't in his system at all because she didn't actually have any. The MRE packaging sat in her locker along with a replacement set of trauma shears marked with a call sign, a field trauma manual dated 1998, and a photograph of a boy who was now a man in dress uniform lying in an ICU bed. She opened the locker and looked at these items the way an archaeologist might examine artifacts from another life. They belonged to Commander Danielle Ross, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to JSOC Task Force 121. They didn't belong to Nurse Danielle Ross at Cedar Creek Medical in Colorado Springs. The challenge coin was heavier now than it had been this morning. She turned it over in her palm, issued at the Afghan refugee camp when that 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble was officially processed for American adoption. His adoptive father, Colonel Marcus Webb, had pressed it into her hand and said, "You got him out. You gave him a future. This is so you remember that part of yourself when you start feeling lost." She'd carried it every day for 20 years. Tarnished now. Worn at the edges. worth everything and nothing, depending on who was watching. The ER continued its rhythm around her, monitors beeping their steady songs, feet moving across tile, the smell of antiseptic and something else underneath, something like resignation. A trauma code came through around 1400, a motorcyclist versus a sedan, serious head injury, possible abdominal bleed. She suited up automatically, muscle memory operating independently of her conscious mind. This was the last code she'd run at Cedar Creek Medical, and she didn't yet know it. The trauma surgeon, a different attending, one who'd never worked directly with Prescott's inner circle, nodded at her as she stepped into the bay. No one had told him yet. The institutional information networks moved through email and formal channels. He wouldn't know until tomorrow that her presence here was temporary. She placed an 4 in the patient's brachial artery with a single smooth motion. Her hands moved like they always did. Steady. Certain. The kind of hands that had done this in field hospitals and forward operating bases and cramped emergency rooms across 4 theaters of operation. The kind of hands that had held lives together when no one else was available to do it. By 1800 hours, the word had started circulating. A couple of nurses gave her odd looks. The OR director stopped by the locker room and asked if everything was all right. Word traveled in hospitals faster than any official notification, carried on the whispered networks of people whose livelihoods depended on reading institutional tea leaves and understanding which way the wind was blowing. Tuesday morning, the conference room filled with 22 nurses. Prescott stood at the head of the table with a termination letter in his hands and the confidence of a man who controlled every variable in the room. 3 board members sat behind him. The hospital's HR director occupied a chair near the door, clipboard positioned like a weapon. Danielle Ross, Prescott announced, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority he didn't possess, your employment at Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective immediately for dangerous disregard for established procedures. Your unauthorized intervention using non-medical materials endangered patient safety and violated institutional protocol. He slid the letter across the table with the careful precision of a man serving legal documents. She read the termination without expression. 17 violations listed. For witness statements attached. 1 recommendation from hospital administration. The letter smelled faintly of printer ink and something else, something like the particular satisfaction that comes from successfully executing a plan. The patient stabilized, she said quietly. Irrelevant. Prescott's voice had the texture of polished steel. Policy exists for a reason, Commander. Not everyone can operate at your level. Some of us require structure. The emphasis on her rank sounded like an insult disguised as acknowledgement. She removed her badge, simple laminated plastic with her photograph and employee number, and placed it on the table. The badge was the only piece of the Cedar Creek Medical identity that mattered. The nursing credentials were temporary, the scrubs were borrowed authority, but the badge was the institutional key. Without it, she became transparent. Without it, she was no longer embedded. 22 nurses watched her stand. The HR director made a note. Security appeared near the doorway, the same guard who'd helped move her boxes the previous day, an older man with that particular bearing of someone who'd done military service himself. Their eyes met for half a second and something passed between them, recognition that neither had expected to find in this place. She walked toward the door with the posture of someone who still owned the room. As she passed through the frame, her hand moved to her scrub pocket one final time. The challenge coin was there, as it had been for every shift over 2 years. Tarnished. Worn. The single piece of her real identity she'd never surrendered to Cedar Creek Medical, never placed on any institutional table. Mission failure. The surveillance operation on Dr. Chen collapsed the moment she intervened in that trauma bay. 2 years of embedded observation, of careful documentation, of watching administrative patterns and email communications and understanding exactly which financial decisions had been made with outside influence. All of it erased because a man whose childhood face she recognized had come through the doors with a tension pneumothorax and the trauma surgeon had hesitated. She'd traded the mission for his life. It was the kind of calculation that got soldiers killed, but in that moment with his oxygen saturation dropping toward irreversibility, it had been the only calculation that mattered. Wednesday morning at 0300 hours, she sat alone in an empty diner on the western edge of Colorado Springs. The place was called Murphy's, the kind of establishment where the fluorescent lights never quite went out and the coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Rain hammered against the windows, thick Colorado rain with the smell of ozone and dust and something like electricity. The waitress refilled her cup without asking, recognizing the look of someone who'd be there until the coffee ran out or the rain stopped, whichever came first. Danielle stared at her reflection in the dark glass. The woman looking back had 20 years of military service embedded in her posture and scars that didn't show in office lighting. She'd cleared minefields in Kandahar. She'd extracted wounded soldiers from active firefights. She'd stood in field hospitals and made decisions that determined which lives got saved and which ones became statistics. And she'd been defeated by a man in a pressed suit and a hospital's standard operating procedures. The challenge coin sat on the table between her hands. She turned it over repeatedly, the way a monk might turn prayer beads. Tarnished silver that had once been bright. Worn edges where it had been handled 10,000 times. The inscription on the back was barely legible now, a unique call sign and a date and the words for Valor in letters that had faded to ghost marks. This was rock bottom. Not the kind that came from physical injury or operational failure, but the specific kind that came from institutional machinery recognizing that you didn't belong and grinding you into absence. She'd survived ambushes. She'd survived the kind of shock that made bodies shut down and minds fragment. She'd survived the particular loneliness of being embedded so deep that going home felt like surfacing from a dive without decompression. But this quiet defeat in a diner in Colorado Springs, this was a new kind of wound. The waitress brought pie she hadn't ordered. Apple. The kind that came with vanilla ice cream melting into the filling. Rough night, she asked, not unkindly. Rough 2 years, Danielle said. The waitress nodded like she understood, which meant she'd probably been a spouse to someone in uniform or a daughter of someone who served. The recognition was wordless. It gets better. Not right away, but it does. Danielle didn't tell her that better meant reassignment or reactivation or slipping back into an identity so thoroughly that Colorado Springs and Cedar Creek Medical became a classified footnote in an operational file nobody could talk about. Better meant understanding that the boy she'd pulled from rubble was now a man standing in a hospital wearing dress uniform, and she'd just destroyed her own ability to watch his recovery. The rain continued until 0600, then shifted to drizzle. By the time she paid her tab and stepped outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, not quite dawn, but the promise of it. The parking lot was empty except for her vehicle and the particular silence that comes before morning traffic. She was halfway to her car when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Cedar Creek Medical's main line. Commander Ross. A male voice she didn't recognize. This is Dr. James Wheeler, Chief of Surgery. I was in the OR when your colonel came through. I read the termination paperwork this morning and I need you to know, what you did in that bay saved his life. We all saw it. We just couldn't say anything yet. Yet? She heard something in her own voice shift, the slight edge of a question, of hope held in careful suspension. Friday morning, he said. The colonel is being discharged. He's requested a recognition ceremony. You should be there. She ended the call without promising anything. But she noted the date and time. Friday morning. Cedar Creek Medical's main atrium. The colonel in dress uniform, finally stable enough to stand. Some missions lasted for years. Some last for seconds. And some, it seemed, lasted long enough to resurrect themselves from the wreckage of bureaucratic defeat. The termination paperwork materialized Friday afternoon like a summons no one had the courage to refuse. Dr. Prescott walked into the administration wing carrying a accordion file thick with 17 documented violations, each one stamped and initialed and ready for the executioner's blade. The board members, 3 of them, all wearing expressions that suggested they'd already made their decision before he walked through the door, nodded as he presented each page. Dangerous disregard for established procedures. Protocol violations with patient safety implications. Use of non-standard medical supplies in direct contradiction of Joint Commission standards. The words landed like hammers. He'd spent 3 days building this documentation trail with the precision of a man constructing a coffin one nail at a time, and now he stood before them like a surgeon holding the incision perfectly still, waiting for permission to cut deeper. By 1645, it was done. The decision was unanimous. The paperwork was signed. Danielle was called to the ER nursing station at 1700, where Drive Prescott stood waiting, his white coat immaculate, his lanyard catching the overhead lights like a noose. The entire nursing staff was present, at least 40 of them, positioned strategically so that everyone would witness what came next. This wasn't a private conversation. This was a public execution dressed in corporate language. His voice was clinical, measured, the tone of a man reading a grocery list. Your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective immediately. You will surrender your badge, access codes, and all hospital property. Security will escort you from the building. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. Her hands remained steady as she unclipped her badge from her scrub pocket, the plastic worn smooth from 2 years of constant contact, and placed it on the counter between them. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical drone, indifferent witnesses to the destruction of a career. What Dr. Prescott didn't know, what he could never know, was that Commander Danielle Ross's nursing position had never been about healing patients. It had been about surveillance cover. 2 years of embedded intelligence work, monitoring a procurement officer in hospital administration suspected of channeling medical equipment to foreign intelligence networks. The colonel's arrival, the emergency procedure, the improvisation that saved his life, it had all burned the operation down to ash. Her exposure meant the intelligence network collapsed. The mission failed. The asset she'd been tracking for 24 months disappeared into the federal system before anyone could move on him. And now, standing in front of the entire nursing staff while Dr. Prescott read the termination language like scripture, she felt the weight of something far heavier than shame. The escort to the parking lot took 7 minutes. Security, a young man named Marcus who'd always nodded at her in the hallways, kept his eyes forward. Rain had begun falling in Colorado Springs, the kind of rain that came off the mountains angry and cold, hammering the pavement like accusations. She didn't go home. Home meant answers she couldn't give, paperwork she couldn't file, a classified debrief she wasn't ready to face. Instead, she drove to the edge of town where the diner called Mel sat under a flickering neon sign that read open 24 hours like a promise nobody kept. The parking lot was empty except for a Dodge Caravan with a busted taillight and a couple of semis parked along the back edge, their drivers probably sleeping inside the cabs to avoid the storm. She ordered coffee, black, no sugar, and sat in a booth by the window where she could watch the rain hammer the glass and her own reflection stare back at her like a stranger. The coffee went lukewarm after the first 15 minutes. By 0300, it was cold enough to film over. The diner smelled like fryer grease and coffee grounds and the kind of permanent exhaustion that soaked into the walls and never quite left. An old man 2 booths away was sleeping with his head tilted back against the headrest, his mouth open, his breathing the only sound besides the hum of the kitchen and the percussion of rain. The waitress, a woman named Barb whose name tag was held on with a safety pin, stopped asking if she wanted anything else around 0200. Some people were just there to sit. Barb understood. Danielle reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the tarnished challenge coin. It was the size of a quarter, struck from aircraft aluminum that had been salvaged from a Black Hawk that went down outside Kandahar in 2004. The edges were rough where someone had filed them smooth by hand. On one side, the unit insignia. On the other, a date, February 17, 2004, and 4 words in military block letters, Valkyrie does not break. She'd received this coin the day she'd pulled an 8-year-old boy from the rubble of a compound that had been vaporized by a Taliban IED. She'd given him blood from her own vein when the field medics ran out of O-negative. She'd visited him in the refugee camp every week for 6 months until the adoption papers were finalized and he'd become an American citizen. At his citizenship ceremony, his adoptive father had pressed this coin into her palm and said, "For the woman who saved my son's life." This is so he never forgets. So you never forget. She'd kept it in her locker for 2 years. In her scrub pocket for the last 6 months. Close enough to touch whenever the weight of maintaining her cover threatened to break through her composure. And now, sitting in a diner at 0315 with the rain beating against the windows like it was trying to get inside, that coin felt heavier than every medal she'd ever earned. Heavier than the Bronze Star. Heavier than the Silver Stars, plural, because there had been 2 of them, for 2 separate operations that still couldn't be discussed at dinner tables. Heavier than the Defense Superior Service Medal that had been presented in a classified ceremony with exactly 4 people in the room. This coin weighed more than all of it combined because it represented a mission that wasn't classified. A debt that was personal. A child who had become a warrior. And a cover story that had just been obliterated in front of 40 witnesses. The catastrophe crystallized somewhere around 0330. She'd known intellectually that saving the colonel meant exposure. That emergency procedure, the improvised chest seal fashioned from MRE packaging because proper equipment wasn't available, had violated every protocol Prescott could weaponize. But knowing something intellectually and understanding it viscerally were different frequencies of the same disaster. The 2-year intelligence operation on the procurement officer had been subtle, methodical work. Passive observation. Document collection. Scheduled meetings with handlers in parking garages and coffee shops. The kind of work that required invisibility, and invisibility required a role so mundane that no one looked twice. A trauma nurse. Respected but not remarkable. Competent but not memorable. Utterly, completely ordinary. Except the colonel had needed her hands to be extraordinary. And when she'd used those hands to save his life, she'd used them with muscle memory built across 20 years of SEAL team operations, Delta Force insertions, and classified rescue missions that had never made the news. The procedure had worked with too much precision. The timing had been too perfect. A regular trauma nurse might have tried to stabilize him. Commander Danielle Ross had moved like someone who'd done emergency procedures under fire in Kandahar, Fallujah, and 3 other locations she still couldn't name in civilian conversation. Dr. Prescott had seen it. Had understood, on some subconscious level, that something was wrong with the way she moved. Wrong with the authority in her voice. Wrong with the certainty in her hands. And instead of ignoring that instinct like a reasonable person, he'd accelerated toward it like a man determined to unmask a fraud even if it meant pulling his own foundation down with her. The rain intensified. The old man in the other booth stirred, muttered something incoherent, and settled back into sleep. Barb emerged from the kitchen to refill the coffee stations, glanced at Danielle without seeing her, the way service workers learn to look through customers who are clearly somewhere else entirely, and disappeared back into the stainless steel kitchen where the grill was cooling down for the night. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. It had already ended hers. The colonel's commendations would come out soon, the news would spread, and everyone would understand that Cedar Creek Medical had terminated the woman who'd saved a Green Beret's life. By Monday, that narrative would own every healthcare website in Colorado. By next week, it would reach the national nursing organizations. By the end of the month, Dr. Prescott's name would be radioactive in every medical community that mattered. But that was cold comfort in a diner at 0315 with a stone-cold cup of coffee and a tarnished challenge coin that represented a mission that was now, officially and irreversibly, compromised. She had options. She could activate her handler. Could extract. Could be reassigned to a different operation in a different city with a different cover story. She could walk away from nursing and return to active operations. She could disappear into the infrastructure of classified work and pretend that the last 2 years had been a detour, a mistake, an acceptable loss in the larger calculus of national security. But as she sat there in that diner, watching her reflection blur and sharpen in the rain-streaked window, she understood something that no debriefing officer could teach her. The mission wasn't about the procurement officer anymore. The mission had become something larger. The mission had become about a boy she'd pulled from rubble 20 years ago who'd grown into a warrior. The mission had become about protecting that narrative from people like Dr. Prescott, who would weaponize it, bury it, erase it if it meant defending his own institutional power. The rain continued its percussion against the glass. The coin felt heavy in her hand. And somewhere on the other side of the mountains, a general was probably being briefed about what happened at Cedar Creek Medical. The intelligence operation was compromised, yes. The cover was blown, yes. But something else had just begun. Something that Danielle couldn't yet see clearly but could sense, like a seismic shift, like the moment before an earthquake when the earth holds its breath and decides which way it's going to break. She finished her cold coffee. Left a $20 bill on the table, triple the cost, because Barb deserved it for understanding the language of silence. Walked back out into the rain where Cedar Creek Medical waited in the distance, its light still burning, still healing, still turning on its axis of institutional politics and power, and the thin, fragile space where warriors became nurses and nurses became legends. Subscribe for more stories about the warriors hiding in plain sight. Like this video if you believe true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And comment below, if you held a secret that could change everything, would you keep it buried or burn it all down?